again, Christian DuPont, and I'm the Burns librarian, and on behalf of the Burns Library staff, of which there are several, I see a couple of our archivists. There's Lynn and Em here, and Caroline, who's joined us lately as our administrative assistant, is floating about and helping people get situated, and all of our staff here in Burns Library and the BC Libraries. Thank you for your interest in this program, for coming this evening, and we hope you really enjoy the evening, okay? So, and some of you are here for the duration, right? We call this double header event. I see nods, it's working, okay? The caterers couldn't believe it downstairs. Usually those of you who are regulars, we kind of have a little pre-reception and a talk, but we have two special people here tonight, and you'll learn more about them as we introduce them. But Hilary is going to talk for a good hour here for us and about Máire Comerford, and then we're going to go downstairs, and that's where we're going to have the sandwich and salad supper and bar service, okay? And then we'll be coming back upstairs here for Joe's film, The Reefer and the Model, 7-ish, okay? So that's the program, and you can feel free. Some of you, we know, aren't able to stay for the whole time, okay? So that's fine. You can let yourselves, back out at the time. We hope that you will at least stay for a little bit of a drink and social in between here, okay? And who knows, others might be arriving just for the film. We have some film courses being taught here on campus, and so we're in for just a nice, relaxing, and a very enjoyable evening together. So before and I just want to say, this is so moving to think about. Máire is back in Boston. Here we are, right? So this is great. So 100 years ago, Máire Comerford, came to America, and we're going to learn a lot more about her, but wouldn't she be delighted to see this crowd here this evening? But before, again, talking more about introducing Hilary and this evening's talk, let me thank, by the way, some sponsors for this event, and talk about upcoming programming by the way of doing that. So first of all, this evening, we're very grateful to the Era Society of Boston, and I see our acting president here, Bill Smith, is with us, and several other Era Society members. Kate I know very well, and longtime secretary, and Betsy I hadn't met before. So who else is a member of the Era Society of Boston here? I know Michael Collier, and there's Catherine Shannon. Catherine, you can raise your hand twice, because many of us are also members of the Charitable Irish Society, and Catherine Shannon, who many of you know and beloved, has also been a past president of the Charitable Irish Society, okay? But the Era Society provided some funding for this event, and then two very special members of the Era Society, beloved to us, Tom and Tricia Cardy, provided a little extra gift for this evening. And has anyone seen Tom and Trish this evening? No, you're in the wrong city. They are landing in Venice this evening, okay? Trish has a milestone birthday. So, but that's the commitment again. They so much love the Era Society, the kind of events we do together. They said, we really want to make this event happen. And so that reminds me too, because Tom said, Christian, the only favor I asked in return, and it's not part of that charitable tax deduction, no, it's I want a signed copy of the book. And so really good news, okay, is because it was promised that we'd have some copies of On Dangerous Ground here for sale. This is Hilary's edited memoir of Máire Comerford. There's a table downstairs. By the time we go down for dinner and drinks, there'll be a student there from our bookstore, and we'll have copies for sale, okay? Hilary will be about, and people will recognize you from your talk here, and can just, if you want to have a copy signed, you can certainly do that, okay? So copies will be downstairs during the break. So again, thank you to the Era Society. We also really do all our events in partnership with the Boston College Program of Irish Studies, and we have some upcoming talks and flyers here, and this is my opportunity to introduce Guy Biner. There he is, okay, who is our Sullivan Chair of Irish Studies. And let me do this so everyone can hear you better, is grab the mic. And Guy, well, why don't you just come up here? Goodness. What am I thinking? I'm not very welcoming here. No, you're not going to prepare, but you want to talk about Rita Duffy.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so please, take a moment.
Turn away, Dean Oshla. I didn't prepare any words here, but I did want to mention this is just great to have this partnership with the Burns Library. And in particular, it's actually fitting today with Hilary Dully's talk, because the Comerford papers, of course, are here, and we can see graduate students. This is a great research institution beyond anything else. Maybe people are used to coming here for events, but for our students and for students across North America and further afield, we have somebody from Scotland here today. From further afield, this really is a great research institution, and it's great to see how these events, the public events, tie in with the research strengths which we're going to learn more about as we go on. But I did want to mention we have a packed program of high-level events, thanks to Dr. Rachel Young, who's standing over there as our program coordinator, prepared for this term. I'd encourage you to look at them. Look up the website, BC Irish Studies, look up Boston College Irish Studies. You'll see events happening all the time, academic events and other events. For example, tomorrow there's a Gaelic Roots concert with Eilish Kennedy, who's a brilliant singer, in Connolly House. So I'd recommend that you look at that as well if you're interested. But I did want to flag one event, but the many upcoming events, and you can follow them, but one event that might be of interest because it's next Wednesday already, and there's flyers down below. You might want to pick up one of these. We have the remarkable and extremely funny as well, Belfast artist Rita Duffy will be giving a Lowell Humanities talk next Wednesday, which is the prestige talks here at Boston College, and it really is remarkable to have this amazing artist who deals with Irish issues, but with a lot of northern humor. So it deals with the toughest of issues, and I'd recommend people, if you're interested in that, to please stop by next week in Gasson Hall in the evening. So there's information on that as well. Thanks, Christian.
And while you're picking up Rita Duffy's flyer, that reminds me that Catherine Shannon, the Charitable Irish Society and the Ancient Order of Hibernians have organized another event. You'll find flyers downstairs for the weekend of October 5th and 6th. It's a commemoration weekend of the 175th anniversary of the shipwreck of the brig St. John. So Catherine will be pleased to tell you more about that event, and hope you can join. I think emails and other things will be going out soon. If we don't stop talking about other events whenever we get to tonight's event, so I warned Hilary that we can go on a little bit here, this is really kind of a kickoff of the season. And so, as Guy mentioned, the occasion for bringing Hilary and her husband Joe, yes, who are related by marriage and in the family here, right? So Hilary might say a little more about this family relation and Máire Comerford here. But it was last spring when we were discussing about now that Hilary has finished editing the memoirs of Máire Comerford, Joe's aunt, and published the book. Well, what about the drafts of those memoirs and about all the other papers that Máire had left behind? And so yes, that's where we're pleased to become the repository now of Máire Comerford's papers, and we look forward in time here to processing them. There's a lot to go through and make them available for researchers, and we're excited because we know there's a lot of research interest, and you've rescued Máire in this. You've brought her, back into the dialogue here, which is just so wonderful. And the talk you're giving this evening about her coming to America, was not so well known at all. I mean, there are other women who would have come, Hennessy Skeffington and others who came over and gave talks, and we'll hear a little about that context. But we'll learn about Máire's contributions here this evening. So Hilary Dully is, like her husband Joe, this is going to be meant, is a filmmaker and producer, documentary, and film instructor, and has been associated with the University of Galway, has produced a number of films for TG4, the Irish language television station, RTE, Irish National Television Network. Work's been shown at art festivals, and then also as a writer and the editor. So you bring all of these skills to this project here. So I'm going to bring Hilary up here now. And Hilary, did I not last night promise you a surprise guest?
You did.
I did, okay. And he's sitting right over there, but you wouldn't recognize him because you've never met.
Okay.
But you know his name. So if I tell you that's John McColgan sitting over there. Okay, so John, please. And, okay. So. Good, and we're getting it on camera. See, I did it, I love these shows. There we go. Let's get some applause for this, okay? You don't know why yet, but you're gonna find out why this is so special. Will you pick up from here then, Hilary? I'll just sit down, or would you like me to
Well, John
stand in front of
knew Máire and was very involved with trying to help her to organize her archive, and was a very good friend to her as well. When you were studying in Dublin, I think, doing your PhD? Yes. So John and I think we exchanged some emails at one time, but his name came up very frequently when I was looking into the archives, and so it's just fantastic that you're here. So it's really wonderful. Thank you very much.
So let me just say a little more about John, because John is a great citizen of Boston, of course, and he just recently retired, John. It was, well, last year, right? At the same time that we were actually talking about Maura's papers coming here, that as 28 some years as the archivist of the city of Boston. And so we celebrate your career, your many contributions to the city in this way. And John has left many legacies, including here in Boston College. And these are living legacies, because our new head of public services, who joined us in the last few months here in Boston College, worked with John in the city archives. That's Máire Comerford. And Marta's working this evening. She's down at our reference desk, okay? So she and many others get to watch this later on film. So again, thank you. The connections, you know, are just wonderful here. Okay, so take us away. I will go away at this point. There we are.
I just wanted to just say quickly, it's just wonderful for us to be here in Boston. It was a dream of mine to come here to follow in Maura's footsteps, and I'll explain that a bit as I go along. But I would just like to just briefly thank the staff of the Burns Library and of Irish Studies, who have just been so welcoming to us, and it's just been really nice. But I'd especially like to thank Christian, who you know, we've got to know over the last couple of years, and it's been an absolute pleasure to engage with Christian, and so thank you very much, not only for inviting us, but for all that you've done for the archive. So really, I'm going to begin now, which the 800 years long story of Ireland's subjugation is riven with emotion and with conflicting narratives and with sometimes unspeakable tragedy. And finally, following the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in late 1921, with the birthing process of a nation, simultaneously erupting into a very bitter civil war. The treaty with Britain cemented the partition of Ireland, with a 26-county Free State and 6 counties in the north of the country remaining part of the British Empire, to be known as Northern Ireland. Disagreements about acceptance or rejection of the treaty drove a wedge through the united army of citizens and volunteers who had fought in the War of Independence against Britain for an Irish republic. Was it freedom to achieve freedom, as Michael Collins argued, or the betrayal of the principles so poetically set out in the Proclamation of 1916? And what of partition? The excision of the 6 northern counties, making the birth of the new phrase state nation only partial and very painful for those left behind. It was not the Irish Republic that many had fought for in the preceding War of Independence, yet a majority accepted the compromised Free State as the best that could be achieved. But others were not prepared to let the Republican ideal die. Amongst them, a coterie of Cumann women, an all-female, self-governed auxiliary of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Republican Army, some of whom devoted the following decades to keeping the Republican aspiration alive. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of the most significant of these women, Máire Comerford, but also, I suppose, about the concept of the Republican ideal, the devotion it inspired, and how it survived in the following decades after the Civil War. So in her memoir, On Dangerous Ground, which was published in 2021, 40 years after her death, Máire writes about the calamity of the Irish Civil War, when former comrades broke into pro- and anti-treaty factions and began to fight each other. But Máire also writes about how there was a sincere belief that the Republic was not entirely lost following the signing of the treaty. And at the beginning of the Civil War, the comradeship, shared purpose, and unity inherent in the War of Independence did not immediately evaporate. There were ambiguities, divided loyalties, moments of friendship. And it is important to remember this too, that such threads of human emotion and kinship, however frail, are always part of the narrative in war, even in civil war. Up to her death at the age of 89 in 1982, Máire Comerford epitomized the anti-treaty position first forged in 1922, and her archive is how she charts that story, from the revolutionary period to the hunger strikes of 1981, which many historians see as the beginning of a change in thinking in the Republican movement. Her archive contains the story of what Máire herself termed the counter-revolution. But more interesting for me is how it charts subtle and intriguing political developments in Republican thinking through these decades, the backstory, if you like. Máire Comerford understood the importance of the personal archive, the documents that allow us to chart a person's life, their politics, and the wider political climate they operated in. The creation of Máire's archive was a very deliberate act, leaving a trail for future historians and researchers to follow and interpret. And the contents of the collection, curated over 60 years, presents a narrative from the perspective of those who lived with the consequences of the big historical moments and made choices to carry on the Republican ideal in their ordinary lives. So I'm talking a lot about Irish republicanism, and some of you may be wondering just, what does that mean? Well, I've heard people, in one case, a very prominent Irish historian, arguing that the concept of the Irish Republic, or Irish republicanism, was merely an undefined ideal. The argument being that no one really understood what it meant, that it was just a convenient umbrella under which people of diverse political persuasions could stand united during the War of Independence. Well, now, this is highly disputable, because what further definition could anyone ask for than the 1916 proclamation? And which was read out by Pádraig Pearse during the Easter Rising of 1916, and which is both a poetic and very concise political document, and which remains part of our political discourse up to this day. Máire Comerford was clear that the proclamation of 1916 was the touchstone from which Irish republicanism grew and was nourished. And the concept of cherishing all of the children of the nation equally might well be put forward as the noblest bedrock for nation building. And I believe that those, including Máire Comerford, who devoted their lives to the Republican cause, knew exactly what they were fighting for, with a shadow cast over their lives by the lost opportunity to create the Irish Republic in 1922. So, who was Máire Comerford? Well, every life is shaped by experience, and I want to just briefly sketch a picture of Máire's origins and her family, where she came from, and how she came to be the woman that she was. Like, her family pedigree was somewhat gentrified, although unusually it was the Catholic gentry who lived alongside their Anglo-Irish neighbours, many of the Protestant faith, who were supporters of the union with Britain, or at least not outright dissenters. Her maternal grandfather, Thomas Esmond, was a major in the British Army, who won the prestigious Victoria Cross for his bravery in the Crimea, and on his return home became a deputy inspector of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the notorious and much derided police force, mainly manned by Irish men to uphold British rule in Ireland. He was the younger son in a baronet line, whose older brother, Sir Grattan Esmond, was an Irish MP who inherited the family seat Ballinastra in County Wexford. Maura's maternal grandmother, Matilda Esmond, she came from similar stock. She was a renowned beauty in her day, but her family had no great fortune, and after her husband's early death, the family struggled, at least financially. Maura's mother, Eva, was the eldest of the children of Thomas and Matilda, and she was brought up to expect privilege and leisure, and one assumes an acceptable marriage within her societal rank. A gifted horsewoman and tennis player, she did not marry until she was 34, and then, in the eyes of her family, she married beneath her station. Her husband, James Comerford, was a friend and neighbour of Parnell, and he was a flour mill owner and also an expert horseman, and they met hunting. They had 4 children in quick succession, and Máire was their firstborn. The flour mill in Rathdrum was initially successful, but when Máire's father refused to bleach his flour, as was the fashion at the time for whiter and whiter flour, things went downhill, and James Comerford steadfastly refused to corrupt people's food with bleached flour, no matter the consequences. When Máire was just 13, her father died, and the family were left in relative poverty. When Máire came to know the practical downside of sticking to principles. However, as her life progressed, she was not daunted by the consequence of taking a principled stand. And if this taught her any lesson, it was that standing on principle was admirable, and whatever the consequences, it was a price worth paying. Máire's mother, Eva, now widowed, took her 4 children to live with her own mother and brother and 2 sisters in County Wexford, where they lived at Ballycoursey House, a very pleasant homestead on a 100-acre farm, partly as dependent relatives, at least for a period of time. However, they still had what you might call position in society, engaging in the pursuits and in the society of the gentry. And as Máire recounts, they had many more Protestant than Catholic friends. It was at Ballycoursey that Máire developed her lifelong love of animals, especially horses. And she too, like her parents, became a very accomplished horsewoman. While life at Ballycoursey House was pleasant and privileged, there was no getting away from the fact that the widowed Eva and her 4 children were quintessentially cast as the poor relations. So this half-in, half-out position, lurking on the fringes of the West British way of life, is central to how Máire's character developed. She was always to be someone who saw life through the lens of the less privileged, while feeling at home on the margins, although she clearly maintained the gentility and accent of her upbringing. But Máire was a rebel, and after the 1916 Rising, her life was set on a very different course to what might have been expected for her. It was the beginning of turbulent times in Ireland, and at age 23, she wanted to be part of this opportunity for real change. The debate about Home Rule for Ireland, which was prolonged and contentious, ended when this was suspended at the beginning of the First World War. And the Easter Rising of 1916, which changed the course of history in Ireland, was the final spur for this rebel woman to begin her life of activism and political engagement. After 1916, Máire joined Cumann na mBan, Sinn Féin, which was the political arm of the fight for independence from Britain, and was an earnest and hard-working election worker for the game-changing election of 1918, which brought huge political change for Ireland. The shift was seismic, and the less radical Irish Nationalist Party was effectively wiped out, giving rise to the new political machine that was Sinn Féin. But instead of taking their seats at Westminster in London, the newly elected MPs set up their own parliament in Dublin, the first Dáil Éireann, an act of defiance that is often underestimated in history, on the same day that the first shots of the War of Independence rang out at Solo Headbag in Tipperary. Máire never underestimated the importance of this unilateral declaration of effective independence, and always saw the first and second Dáils as legitimate governments, and the War of Independence and later the Civil War as the fight to maintain these political structures. But by this time, Máire's life had taken a new turn when she became the live-in secretary to the renowned historian and nationalist Alice Stopford Green. And she moved in to live with her at 90 St. Stephen's Green in Dublin. This effectively transported this young woman to the heart of the revolution, living in a house where the politics of the day was paramount and where Mrs. Green held court with leaders of the revolution. Máire became an active member of Cumann na Món on the ground in the War of Independence, cycling all over Dublin, delivering dispatches, carrying arms, securing safe houses. She was also lent out by Mrs. Green to report on British Army atrocities during the War of Independence, and later worked for the Irish White Cross, distributing aid to those families affected by the loss and death during this period. Now, this position with Alice Stopford Green was hugely important for Máire when she developed intellectually and politically and began to understand the cut and thrust of political manoeuvrings, while simultaneously bicycle-born, engaging in the revolution at street level. And this dual aspect experience was essential in how she would develop as an activist in later years. But of course, the notion of compromise with the British, settling for something less than a 32-county Irish Republic, was floating around prior to the signing of the infamous treaty in 1921. Mrs. Green and Máire, perhaps representing experience and expediency versus fervent idealism and youth, came to an inevitable parting of the ways, even before the start of the Civil War. And this split, as a part of the tragic split of a people, so often portrayed as brother against brother, was equally devastating for women, sister against sister, leading to the utter horror of the Civil War. And it still beggars belief, 100 years later, that such a unified movement for independence from Britain, albeit with all shades of political opinion within the broad organisation of Sinn Féin, could be split apart, killing and executing one another. It is a tragedy that is still hard to fathom. So I'm just going to let you hear from the woman herself now. And I'm going to play a section of audio of Máire talking about the impact of this split in later years. This was recorded for Irish radio in the 1970s.
Can you remember the evening at the time of the treaty? Can you remember your emotions or feelings?
Oh, yes. It was, there was a little paragraph in the morning papers
Can you remember the evening at the time of the treaty? Can you remember your emotions or feelings?
Oh, yes. It was, there was a little paragraph in the morning papers in the latest news box to say that something had been signed. And because we didn't know what it was, something had been signed in London. I remember being in meeting P.S. O'Hegarty, and he put me in his book afterwards and said that I had rejoiced over the signing of the treaty. 'Tis true that I met him, but we had no idea what was in the treaty until that afternoon, until the evening papers came. And that was a dreadful blow, absolutely dreadful blow. I was in the mansion house that night at the Dante commemoration, 500th commemoration. It was a big occasion for the Minister for Cultural Relations of Valera, Count Plunkett. And also in the supper room there was the Éamon de Valera was going on. So I saw de Valera coming back from Limerick. He was arriving in, and he got this letter, which was the terms of the treaty. And it had already been in the evening papers, but he got this letter. He hadn't been given the courtesy of having it before it was published. And then I left the thing, the Dante thing. He was sitting on the platform there and everything looking very glum, but this concert was going on. And I went into Éamon de Valera, and there you just went through and you talked to your friends and you found people that you agreed with and people that you would probably never speak to again. The cleavage was so complete.
That was a sad time.
Oh, it was a dreadful time. It was a dreadful day. And then it went from bad to worse, of course, all the time. But I have been reading just quite lately. I've been reading the Dáil debates the day after the treaty was accepted, as you know, by a majority of 57 to 64, 64 to 57. Very small majority, and one reading. It was accepted, and then they all met again. And that day's debate is extremely interesting. It shows the goodwill there was to try and hold the Republican movement together, to try and stop a split and try not to have fighting. It's very striking.
I think it's interesting too that I suppose 99% of the women went anti-treaty at the time. Could you account for this?
Well, we were all for the Republic. And you see, the politicians at that debate I was talking about, de Valera said that he had been trying to prepare the Dáil for a compromise. Didn't say it in so many words, but that was what it was. It was the leadership apparently recognized that they would do something which was a compromise. But we who were in the Republican forces, particularly in the volunteers or Cumann, we had been kept going by the assurance all the time that we were defending an established government, and it was democratically elected, it was established, and it would never be given away. It was the rock, we were standing on this rock and we were defending that. And so the blow was, it was a dreadful blow. And our comrades had died for that. And also, I suppose I felt particularly involved because the people I had been meeting when I was going around the country, the people who had really suffered, the poor and the unemployed, we had asked them to make sacrifices, which were just being thrown overboard by these politicians who thought some settlement would do all right. But as things happened, of course, the democratic program and the old traditional claims of Ireland and the claims made for the Irish people were all dropped at that time.
So for Máire and for most of the Cumann members, this capitulation to compromise was not something they could do. And following the ratification of the treaty in the Dáil in 1922, Cumann as an organisation voted decisively against the Articles of Agreement signed in London. They were the first Republican organisation of significance to take this position, and it can be argued they paid dearly for literally sticking to their guns, because not only did they vote against the treaty, but they dusted themselves down, and many became active combatants. The role played by women during the Irish Civil War is often underestimated, and Máire's service exemplifies their gusto and bravery, their principled stand against the fatal compromise of the treaty with Britain. And just how significant their stance was can be garnered from the backlash against them, from what became known as Free Staters, beginning in earnest with Patrick Sarsfield O'Hegarty's book, oddly called The Victory of Sinn Féin, and first published in 1924. And in this virulently pro-treaty polemic, O'Hegarty rails against the anti-treaty side, but he holds particular contempt for the anti-treaty women, describing them as practically unsexed, their mother's milk blackened to make gunpowder, their minds working on nothing save hate and blood. Women, O'Hegarty declared, were largely responsible for the bitterness and ferocity of the Civil War. Now that is a very revealing and important statement from O'Hegarty, because in the bitter post-Civil War era, the substantial contribution of women in the fight for freedom from Britain was subsequently traduced or vilified and then effectively erased. In the subsequent decades, women of the revolutionary period were substantially disappeared from the historical canon of the period. Now, Cumann na Món began their fight against the treaty in earnest with the Heads Up propaganda campaign, which ran from January to August 1922, with bills like these posted around the streets of Dublin, and a large number of these original posters surviving in Máire Comerford's archive. The messages, as you can see from these examples, are pithy and short, very uncompromising. And the campaign included writing, printing, and posting these messages of defiance and dissent all over Dublin. But Máire Comerford was not content with merely posting bills, and by June 1922, she was ensconced in the forecourts in Dublin at the heart of the Civil War, one of the few women there for the bombardment. And when the anti-treaty forces surrendered that position, Máire Comerford made straight to join the fighting in and around O'Connell Street in Dublin, based at the Hammond Hotel, careering around the city in an ambulance or cycling through the fighting to deliver dispatches. It is not surprising that in 1923, the Daily Mail newspaper described Máire Comerford as the most daring woman working for the Republican cause. Her accounts of the Civil War in her memoir, On Dangerous Ground, are particularly memorable, vivid, and emotional. In late 1923, following Máire Comerford's arrest and imprisonment by the Free State, she travelled to America and spent 9 months here working for the Republican cause, fulfilling a number of speaking engagements and raising money for Republican prisoners back home, with hundreds still on hunger strike. During this period, Máire wrote her letters home to her mother, which survive in her archive. Central to the contents of these letters is Máire's extraordinarily close relationship with her mother Eva, a Republican herself and one-time housekeeper for Michael Collins during the War of Independence, a staunch and steadfast support for her daughter, defining this relationship as probably the closest intimate relationship of Máire's life. While preparing for this talk, I read and reread those letters home and began to think seriously about historical narrative, the emphasis on what happened, where and when, like a chronological step through a period of time. But these letters are not that, although there is a certain day-by-day, month-by-month progression. What really engaged me is how the picture they paint is mercurial and deeply layered. And while the content is often concerned with the ongoing and increasingly pessimistic picture for the Irish Republic and the anti-treaty position, they also provide charming vignettes of Máire's view and experience of life in America in what was, like this year, a presidential election year 100 years ago. The letters are about what was happening during Máire's trip, but perhaps more importantly, They expose the creeping realization of defeat, the quicksand nature of trying to find a foothold in the new political landscape for Irish republicanism. The Irish-American organizations, so pivotal and important in the period prior to the Civil War, were themselves split and floundering in the fallout, which Máire found very frustrating. What she relates in her memoir and from these letters home, it is clear that Republicans are struggling in every way, including fundraising and garnering any support of consequence for their cause. She was requested by Éamon de Valera to travel to America in May 1923, as this memo attests to, but she was unfortunately arrested soon after, imprisoned, and endured a 27-day hunger strike. Once released and recovered, she was appointed as the election organizer for the entire county of Cork for the Anti-Treaty Sinn Féin, which Máire herself described as a Herculean task. She finally set sail for America in November 1923, traveling on this false passport, which she procured nefariously in London when she became Edith Lewis, artist. So I'm just going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of Máire's trip through East Coast America at the very end of 1923 and on into 1924, traveling by train from New York to Boston, Chicago, Washington, speaking and organizing and fundraising at over 50 venues for Republican prisoners and dependents back home. And these flyers from her speaking engagements, and many of these still survive in her archive. So from the beginning, in a letter dated to her mother the 4th of December, this was when she was shortly arrived, she laments the lack of news from home received in America and asks that all propaganda be forwarded to her personally. She writes that Republicans are completely boycotted by the press and that the skyscrapers are wonderful and go up so quickly, the streets of New York much dirtier than Dublin, and everything a fiendish price. There is excitement, a sense of purpose, plans for her tour and speaking engagements in the pipeline. In a letter of December 19th, she expresses her ongoing worry about Republican prisoners still incarcerated and her fears that they may lose more lives in the recovery from the strikes, and many will never be the same. The rank and file people are wonderful here, she says. With the leaders, she listens to everything that is said, but says very little herself. By this time, she has made her debut speaking at an event, describing it as being awful. But the audiences were very kind, and the average collection, $2 per head, although the audiences are the poorest people, maids and working people mostly. She laments that she has forgotten how to behave or what to say in drawing rooms and can't keep her eyes off the door. Her first entreaties begin early about her wish to return home. America, she thinks, has become indifferent to Ireland altogether. On the other hand, she describes our people having a grand poster parade on Broadway every night for about 2 hours, about 30 women and men, 20 yards apart, walking down the footpath towards the crowd, creating a lot of attention, and their supporters being in the stage for cheering that Republicans were 3 or 4 years ago in Ireland. She hasn't made contact with some of those who she has letters of introductions to. She needs, she writes, to swat up on some manners first. She goes from New York to Washington, and in a letter of the 11th of January, she thanks her mother for clippings, newspaper clippings, which will provide material for the Irish World newspaper articles she is starting to write. But Máire is still dreadfully homesick. It's time, she writes, that someone else who will be a credit to the Republic comes in her place. She's trying to save up to bring a decent motorbike back and suggests that she and her mother would have a fine time with a bike and a sidecar. In the only letter of the collection not addressed to her mother, she writes to her comrade Sheila Humphreys on the 30th of January 1924, hoping that Sheila is getting a bit fat again after the hunger strike. She refers to upcoming local elections in Ireland and wonders if there's any hope of the old Dáil meeting again for propaganda purposes, which could be useful to those like herself working to change opinion in America. It is, Máire concedes, a big problem for Republicans that the Dáil approved the treaty, but argues that from the perspective of distance, it can seem more optimistic and they have all the cards still to play, but have just been playing them so badly. She writes about the importance of educating on the lost Republican ideal, a loss she believes that brought them to their ruin. Only this, she clarifies, must happen alongside a continuing military struggle. Peace, she writes, needs harder work and stronger hearts than war. There is a palpable sense of optimism in combat with accelerating doubt, not about the rectitude of their cause, which seems unbreakable, but about how it will be forwarded in the face of a political settlement in Ireland. Money is a constant theme in the letters. Her only source of independent income is a weekly article for the Irish World, only paid $5. She hopes that they will be able to build up a decent organization in the US before the summer, but laments that they have no pamphlets or propaganda from back home to sustain them, and that lack of funds is holding them back. In America, she argues, you have to spend money to make progress, and Máire is trying to do wonders without spending a penny at all. The biggest issue, she writes, is apathy. You get the sense that the Republicans are fighting a losing battle, but Máire remains focused on hard work and organization. But it doesn't seem to be anybody's job back home to keep them up to speed and send them what they need to foster a real campaign. She writes that she'd sooner be at home in jail. She longs to be back in Ireland, where energy counts and where she doesn't have to stay neutral in the rows that develop in the Irish-American organizations, lamenting the lack of unity of purpose. The Republic, she writes, is the private property of no one. There are allusions to acrimony and cliques. In March, she writes about how the brother-killing brother arguments are keeping people away from supporting their anti-treaty position and their absolute need to turn the tide. She is trying so hard to find a way forward to promote their cause, but finds the Free State propaganda is focusing on Ireland settled down now and not of any more interest for war correspondents, but the roads being made right for tourists and a nice, pleasant holiday guaranteed with no disagreeable sights. She urges Cumann na mBan and Sinn Féin to get every dead wall in the country painted and kept so. She suggests slogans: a free state by duress, the Republic lives on, you can kill men, but not an idea. She suggests an alternative tourist development agency, arranging for guides who know all the ambush sites and burned barracks, who can talk and accompany the tourists, trot them around, advise them where to go. She also advises that you cannot imagine how important it is going to be that no Americans going on tour to Ireland this summer come back as free staters. If they do, she warns, it reacts all over the place and does more harm than we can undo in 6 months. And she again urges her mother not to forget the use of walls, especially on steamrolled roads. On March 16th, Máire writes from the Hotel de la Salle, Chicago, again lamenting the infighting and confusion about what they're doing in America, and that she has turned into a grumbler, but she hates to see things going less well than they should, and not through the fault of their enemies, but through their own disunity. She asks her mother to please look out for a job for her, for surely she will be home in a matter of months. But in April, her spirits pick up. She's taken for a ride in a small aeroplane, which she illustrates in her letter, including the moves and the swoops and the landing. Maura writes that she was also trying to drive a car, but Chicago traffic is terrible, and I didn't enjoy myself much, though we got home all right in the end. Such huge monsters, she concludes, take time to get accustomed to. The men, Maura says, are terrible here. They stick onto your arm and pull you back when you want to go on, and on when you want to go back. I'd sooner be in handcuffs sometimes, she writes. She is worried about how the organization is functioning in America and despairs of the structure or lack of them in place. The trouble, she suggests, is that at home one can work from the bedrock up, but here in America there seems to be no foundations that are fit to build on. In a letter dated April the 28th, she is anxious that she hasn't heard a word of instruction about herself from Sinn Féin back home, and insists that she is coming home soon if she hears nothing further. She says that she doesn't want to be mean when the need at home for funds is so great, but writes that her mother knows how Maura loathes doing what she thinks is wrong, when the same effort done right would get results. They never, she complains, get a bit of news or propaganda from Sinn Féin. By the end of the week in which she writes, Maura will have addressed 40 meetings in Chicago. She asks her mother jokingly if she admires the fortitude of the people in the audience or Maura's more. She says that she is deadly stale on the talking stunt here, doesn't know what to say next, the same row of faces every night. And then she writes, the old Fenians that have been attending Irish meetings for 40 years and up have forgotten more than she ever knew. And then being escorted home by someone whose conversation shows that she gave the exact impression she thought she was avoiding. In May, she writes from the Park Hotel in New York. She still hasn't made use of the letters of introduction and hasn't any time, manners, or clothes for it. She writes that she took a spree to Niagara on her way back to New York. It was wonderful, she writes, but rather hard to see properly on account of an unusual mist and a downpour of rain. There were some Germans in the party, taking photos of each other's, standing on impossible crags of rock, and one, Maura writes, was so like Dev that I felt less alone. She enjoyed a day away from business and getting delightfully soaked through. Distances, she writes, are abominable in this country, explaining, I spent the last 2 nights in trains. She writes, wish I was back, fondest love, Maura. In June 1924, writing from the Bellevue Hotel in Boston, 2 months before she returns home, you feel a revival of spirit in her letters. She's running flower days and raised $600 for a few hours in Charleston on the anniversary of Bunker Hill. The weather is getting hotter and hotter, and people are dropping dead in Chicago, so she is glad she's not there. Ever resourceful, Maura has discovered that peddlers' permits in New York cost only $2 each. So she is, she writes, expecting to be on the warpath there in a short time. That is, unless, she writes wistfully, that I get the sack and can come home. Yet she hasn't lost her military eye. Boston, she writes, is full of the grandest ambush positions. If we had it to fight instead of Dublin, it would be fine. It would be a great place for flying column operations. She writes, there's a little boat that goes round the harbour for 10 cents. So when I get desperate, I go off on that to get a good blow. The Democratic Convention, held from the 24th of June in New York, writes Maura, is coming in on the radio. But she is not listening to it, declaring the radio is a very overrated amusement, like a very bad gramophone. On the 30th of June, there is confusion. She's distracted as a cable arrives telling her to return, while her boss in America, Skellig, commands me stay. And Dorothy McArdle's letter makes her feel like a worm. She writes that she just broke down at a meeting trying to read it. She writes, I'm trying to get back, but feel so selfish, and there is also the conundrum of what to do here. She is slaved there for 5 weeks and only has $1,000 clear. But she is still a bit of a daredevil. That remains. She writes that Molly Childers, formerly Molly Osgood of Boston, would have laughed to see the other day. We commandeered the very select bandstand on Boston Common and persuaded the cop that we'd lost the necessary permit and had a band from the Gaiety Theatre that offered to play for nothing for us. All within an hour. Net proceeds $15. She signs off, frantic haste and love, Maura. On the 12th of July, she hopes they're not killing the people in Belfast today, writing that the Orange men here turn out too. They had a sort of preliminary parade the other day, but that was very poor. She wonders what they all think in Ireland of American politics now. The two big parties, she writes, with presidential candidates Coolidge and Davis respectively, are in the hands of Wall Street, and we can expect nothing for either of them. Increasingly despondent, Maura wonders why no one seems to consider what is the right course for the Irish here now. She also wonders how long it will be before some new American irregulars, or Minutemen, have to fight again over here just what we are fighting in Ireland. And sometimes it seems as though they are moving fast to some such point. By August, she gets home. And back on Irish soil, Maura hits the ground running. Along with her closest Cumann comrades, they did what might not be expected of women of the time. They placed themselves outside polite society, willfully breaking the law, behaving with what might have been considered very unfeminine defiance, all for the Republic. This newspaper article from 1924, very shortly after Maura returned from America, concerns a court case where she was either the woman in brown or the woman in grey. The girls refused to give their names or recognize the court. The judge was obliged to have the court cleared with loud interjection from female supporters gathered to cheer on the defendants. This behavior, both defiant and uncompromising, was also theatrical, with the performance in court garnering newspaper coverage. These women were very astute propagandists. And following this, a core group of Cumann with Máire Comerford and her old comrade Sheila Humphreys, again at the centre of it, began a campaign of targeting jurors. This was conceived in order to support Republican prisoners facing trial in the Free State courts. So this small group of Cumann women decided that jurors who might sit on such trials should be contacted and persuaded to acquit Republicans if they got the opportunity to do so. This organised campaign of jury intimidation, for that is what it effectively was, lasted for an astonishing 7 years, from 1926 to 1934. Maura and her Cumann comrades were steadfastly and systematically transgressing the behavioural norms expected of women of the time, namely passivity and the acceptance of primarily male authority. It might best be described as political performance art, albeit with time in prison and not applause as the likely outcome. Throughout her life, and right up close to her death, Máire Comerford saw the pen and her ability to write as her greatest weapon. Her journalistic career began in 1935, when she was rescued from a life of poverty in the early years of the Free State, living on a hilltop in County Wexford eking out a precarious living running a small poultry farm. This move into journalism was in many ways her salvation. She became editor of the women's page in the Irish press and stayed there for over 3 decades. She used this platform to continue the struggle, relentlessly pursuing historical research and continuing the fight for the Irish Republic. Over the years, she was involved in numerous organisations and campaigns, including prisoners' rights and civil rights in the north of Ireland. She spoke at Republican rallies, did newspaper, magazine and broadcast interviews, gave of her all to the Republican cause. Now, this constituted her public persona, but for me, what makes the contents of her archive so intriguing is material that narrates what we might call the backstory of Irish republicanism after the Civil War. For example, the position of political prisoners in Ireland was very close to Máire's heart, and she not only advocated publicly for them, but she also engaged in extensive correspondence with them over many decades. She never forgot her own time incarcerated in Mountjoy and the North Dublin Union, when she wrote extensively to her own mother from prison during this period, and many of these letters also survive in her archive. Subsequently, during the dark years for republicanism in the 1930s and 40s, Máire visited and engaged with Republican prisoners, helping them to cope with long periods of detention in the Curragh, sending books, procuring a wireless, making visits. The prisoners' letters to Máire from this period are particularly affecting. Traces of despair dripping softly from the letters, examined and crudely cut up by the prison censor. Her life remained consumed by the fight for an Irish Republic, and she was once again in the thick of it, shifting her focus to the north of Ireland after 1969, in the period euphemistically called the Troubles. In the 1970s, she was again visiting and writing to prisoners, this time in the Maze, who are happy to engage with a woman who had, in her later years, achieved a measure of iconic status within the movement. She wore this very lightly, forever modest, always shying away from blowing her own trumpet. In letters from prisoners of this period, she engages with their welfare and they with hers, while correspondence with leaders in the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association and the IRA show that she remained fully engaged with the struggle, still debating strategy, even when to be an Irish Republican was frowned upon and worse. Máire understood that as an old lady with a genteel voice and a gracious demeanour, impeccable manners, and a proud personal history from the revolutionary period, she could, to some degree at least, present as the acceptable face of republicanism. Although the special branch of the Irish police force, parked outside her home, St. Nessans in Sandyford Village in Dublin, kept an eye on her many visitors from all walks of life, including Republicans in trouble, even going so far as to be there for her funeral. She never stopped looking for outlets for airing her unswerving commitment to the cause, for what was essentially still an anti-treaty position. And she found this outlet after she retired from the Irish Press newspaper. While writing her memoir of the revolutionary period and publishing a book about the first Dáil, she also took advantage of the relatively open forum of writing letters to the editor of newspapers, opening a line of direct communication with the public. Often her letters opened up debates about questions both of history and contemporary politics, eliciting a string of responses and some topics running over weeks. She was very often the only female voice in the mix. Counter-revolutionary Ireland turned out to be a very cold place for women, especially for those deemed as transgressors, as history through these decades clearly shows. And in case you might imagine that Mora's republicanism made her a rigid ideologue or a one-trick pony, well, as my husband Joe, who was Mora's nephew, can attest to, that was certainly not the case, although ponies do feature. Her love of animals forged in her childhood, especially horse riding, remained an important part of her life, and she was riding horses long after she probably should not have been, even after having a stroke, with the same determination as she pursued her political aims. She was, according to my husband, a warm, loving and encouraging aunt who was marvellous company and doggedly independent to the very end. Despite her trenchant lifelong fight for the Irish Republic, which some people found unacceptable, she had few enemies and many friends. And although she had no children of her own, family was central in her life. Máire Comerford's life and politics, so richly revealed in her archive, which has now found a new home in the Burns Library here in Boston College, contains all the elements that have made the recovery of lost, forgotten, or buried women's history so fascinating and vital. And for Joe and myself, it's entirely fitting that she's travelled back over the wide expanse of the Atlantic Ocean in spirit, albeit in many boxes, 100 years after she first landed on American soil. It is our great wish that her wonderful collection will find a new lease of life in the many stories still to be unearthed in her extensive collection, and that scholars, researchers, and creatives will find the same pleasure expanding their knowledge in those boxes of history and stories that I have done. Today, we pass on the baton and look forward to what new angles in scholarship and storytelling will transpire. Gormina Mohagwith, thank you very much.
I'm moved to
I feel
watch
a
it.
little emotional.
I'm very emotional too. We're going to move to questions. I have two questions for Hilary. Okay?
Okay.
And thank you for bringing us Máire's voice from the archives here, right? I've heard you speak on other occasions. I've heard other of your Zoom recordings. I've read some of your work. I believe this is the first time that these letters have been read publicly?
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Yes, so first time that these letters are read publicly. So this is a very special occasion. Back here in Boston, right?
Exactly.
100 years
Yeah.
on.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. And the second question is, did you ever meet Máire Comerford?
No. Unfortunately, I didn't. I just came along too late into Joe's life to meet her. But I think one of the fascinating things about an archive like Máire's, if you have the privilege of being locked away with it and going through it and spending hours getting lost in those boxes, is that you do come to know her very well. So I always say, I never met her, but I think even Joe might agree. I probably know more about his family than he does. So, meeting someone in that way, and that's why I hope that that will be something that scholars in the future will find is extraordinary. She was just, it was such a deliberate act for her to keep everything, to never throw anything away, to be constantly engaging with the Republican ideal. And so I never met her, but I do feel I know her very well.
If you hadn't said that, I would have said that for you. And this is one reason why we do these events and being here. Sitting in front of you are several of our doctoral students and others of our community. This is the work that we do. right?
Exactly.
And that's our great hope that you bring alive to us, is that even though there are people that are too distant in the past, and sometimes it's just by a few years, and sometimes it may be by centuries, but by doing that persistent work of scholarship, collecting and then working from the archives, we can bring people here with us today and into the future in ways that they weren't present. I think that's something you brought up so well in your talk, right? Is that she would have neglected for most of her life. She would be so surprised to see this today. In a way.
Yeah, I think she would be surprised but gratified, because
Correct.
even
Of
though
course.
she was a very modest person, she really wanted not just herself, but all those women who were effectively written out of history. She really wanted their stories to be told, and hers is one of those stories. But like, these stories are duplicated over and over. Perhaps she did a lot more than some others, and she lived a long time, and so she got the chance to, continue the struggle. But I just think it would be the story of women, I think, that she would be particularly happy about.
Good. And I think there are a few more women than men with us here this evening. But that's one of the great, again, bywords of the proclamation, right? All the children equally. Right?
Yeah.
It's wonderful. So I'm holding a mic that I need to pass to others here. I'm seeing hands, so there we go. We have only one, so I'm going to walk about here, Caroline. Yeah, okay. We'd like you to speak into the mic when you ask your questions, so
Okay,
for the benefit of people who are recording
I'll go back.
here.
So I'm just wondering if she had Gwelga, if she was an Irish speaker, and if so, did she write in Irish or give any of her speeches in Irish?
No, she was absolutely at one point like berating herself, because she did try to learn Irish, but she just didn't have the time, really, because she was doing so many other things. And of course, it's very difficult language, as anyone who has tried to learn it in adulthood will attest to. So she wasn't an Irish speaker, but she was a great lover of the language. Yes.
Right behind you.
Yes, thank you for your great talk, and I did read your book when it first came over here. Excuse me. I had worked with the Sinn Féin Women's Department in the mid-'80s, and my big project was going through Sheila Humphrey's things, a few years before she died, and she had them all in these big plastic garbage bags in her closet, mixed in with birthday cards and wonderful letters and photographs that we used. And she talked a lot about Máire Comerford and the things they did. And one of the best days there's a woman, I don't know whether you ever met or heard of Miriam James. She, at that time, she was a member of the Greater London Council, but she had been Cumann na mBan in her day. And she came over to visit, and they sat on the couch, and I spent several hours just listening to them reminisce and slapping each other on the back and laughing uproariously. And so much of what they talked about were things that they did with Máire. So I didn't know whether you used any stories like that or whether you talked to Sheila Humphreys at all.
Well, actually, my husband would have met Sheila Humphreys because they remained very good friends right until the end. And he particularly remembers that Sheila used to make delicious buns, which she would bring to Máire's, and they were very, very close comrades and friends. So, yeah.
Okay, I'm Linda Morrison, and I've done a fair amount of women's history. I was wondering if you think that Sinn Féin, etc., did not send her the materials she needed, partly because she was a woman.
This is a kind of question that I've tried to work out myself, like what was going on. But I think it probably had a lot more to do with just a breakdown in organization. They were the defeated side, and they were, myself and my husband would discuss this, whether De Valera sent her to America because he wanted her out of the way, and because she was troublesome, and she was a rebel woman. So there is that possibility, but I think this breakdown was kind of happening in real time, and it was like affected by what was happening in the Irish American organizations here, the fact that they were split, and that it was almost like they were fighting a losing battle from the very beginning. And even though they were trying their very best, and Irish America had been so vital in the War of Independence, and so vital in terms of even just funds. So much money came from America, and they had come over during the War of Independence. They raised huge amounts of money, and I think they were trying to replicate that, but they were doing it in a way where they were almost like headless chickens. Nobody, they were in shock about what had happened, really, I think. And I think the Civil War had that effect, where people couldn't quite believe that this was the outcome.
Thank you very much. This was a very delightful talk and so informative. I was thrilled with it. And as you suggest, women were very much written out of history for so long in Ireland. It was only in the 1970s that you began to see some of the historiography turn to document the experiences of women, thanks to leaders like Margaret McCurtain, who was a Burns Scholar here many years ago and was a great friend of mine, and also knew Sheila Humphrey and Máire Comerford. I was interested in two things. First of all, what would have been the relationship between herself and De Valera when she worked at the Irish Press? Had he kind of gotten over his fear of strong women?
No, I don't think he ever got over that now, but... But that's an interesting one, okay? Because it's like one of those kind of relationships. I mean, she had been his driver, and she had guided him over mountains, like when he was in hiding, during the War of Independence. So there was that kind of, a relationship that was forged at that time. But she didn't, she wouldn't have had a lot of time for him. But to be fair to him, okay, which we probably should be, he did, I think, orchestrate a job for her in the Irish Press. And that was just brought about a huge change in her life, because she was living in dire poverty. And, she wasn't like other people who came out of the Civil War who had resources, or who were property owners, or who had jobs. She had nothing. She had no home, she had no job, she had no family resources. In fact, like herself and she brought her mother, after she got the job in the Irish Press, she was able to buy this small house, and she brought her mother to live with her. And that was the first home they had, permanent home that they owned and could keep since Rathdrum, when they left and went to live in Ballycourcy. So, like, while the De Valera relationship, she wasn't his biggest fan, of course, because of 1926 and the creation of Fianna Fáil. But, I think he did try to help her. And I think that was based in what had been forged between them when they were on the same side in the War of Independence.
You also mentioned her great interest in what was going on in Northern Ireland and the Civil Rights Association's early campaigns and so forth. And of course, that's the time that feminism is beginning to develop in Ireland in the 1970s. And there were often conflicts between people who were feminists and those who focused on the United Ireland and the acquisition of the Republic. How did she deal with that? What did she think of this rise of a new wave of feminism in the 1970s?
Well, I mean, that's again a very interesting question, because I think she was quite traditional in many of her beliefs, but she tried to engage with feminism, and I think sometimes with some difficulty, some aspects of, I think probably stuff like abortion rights and so on were difficult for her. But she engaged with everyone. I mean, that was what was interesting about her. She never said, I'm just that, or I'm just something else. She was always interested in listening to everyone, and listening to different sides of the story. And I think that old question about the national question versus like the women's question, you know, that's still ongoing. I mean, you know, even to this day, I think that's an issue that hasn't fully been resolved. You know, where do you fall, and which becomes more important? And the women, I think, of her time just believed that it was the national question that had to be sorted out, and then other things would happen. But they were feminists really long before it became, you know, something that people call themselves, because they were a self-governing auxiliary organization, and they made their own rules, and they did things that were often in conflict with what many of the men were thinking, including some of those campaigns I spoke about. So it's an ongoing question, I think.
I see many hands here. We're going to go to Emer next.
And what was her relationship with Michael Collins?
Yeah, I mean, she writes in her autobiography, because she was actually in Cork at the same time that Michael Collins was assassinated. She writes about she couldn't feel sad because of there had just been so much death, so many people had died, and so much had happened, and there would be people who would have held Michael Collins accountable for some of that. But I think as time went on, you see, I think he was such a towering figure in the War of Independence, and so sort of beloved, really, that I think in later life she probably came round a bit to seeing the difficulties he had to deal with, although she would have been very critical about what happened in London, and would have made reference to, you know, the role of alcohol, which Michael Collins, I think, was involved with. So again, a bit like Dev, it's kind of ambiguous and changing. It's not, you know, it's not like some people would say, oh, she was anti-Dev or she was anti-Michael Collins. As she wrote herself, she couldn't feel sad when he died. But, you know, I think, like, going through life, like a lot of us, you kind of look at situations again, and because she was so interested in the history of the period, she was constantly researching and finding out new things. So again, like that, I just think it was ambiguous and not, you know, not one thing or another.
We'll do two more questions.
Hi.
Congratulations on your presentation. I really enjoyed it, Hilary.
Thank you.
A few years ago, I co-authored a book called Sisters of the Revolutionaries, the story of Margaret and Mary Bridget Pearse with my sister Teresa. And there are a lot of parallels, actually, because Mrs. Pearse and Margaret Pearse undertook several tours of the East Coast of the United States to fundraise for the IRA.
In fact, Maura mentions her in her letters,
That's
so
right.
she was here at the same time.
Around the same time.
Yeah.
But they also raised money to keep the doors of St. Enda's School, Patrick Pearse's beloved school in Rathfarnham, opened. But I got the sense, particularly towards the end of Margaret Pearse's life, she had been 30 years, very much involved her whole life in politics as a senator and also very much as an activist. But there was a sense that she was very disillusioned with the direction that Irish politics had gone, particularly in the 1960s. And my question to you is, do you get the same sense from Maura's archive, from her writings? Was she an ardent Republican to the very end, or was there any sense of bitterness in terms of the direction that Irish republicanism had gone, particularly, say, in the 60s and 70s?
No, I think she was an ardent Republican to the end, yeah. I never got any sense that, and when I say that her focus shifted to the north of Ireland, it did, because she saw that as the continuation of the struggle. And, she was very engaged with the north from 1969 onwards. I don't think she ever was embittered or ever felt anything other than the struggle will go on. And in fact, in her memoir, there's a scene in the forecourts, which I always found very moving, where she's talking to Liam Mellows, who would be executed very soon afterwards by the Free State. And he talks about really that this was the end of their struggle, and that there was nothing more that they could do except pass on the flame. And that she was saying, oh, when might it come back? Would it be 5 years, 10 years? And he said, it will not be in our time. And so I think when we look at the North now and see the beginnings of perhaps a move towards a united Ireland, who knows? We hope that, yeah, he was right. It wasn't going to happen then. It wasn't going to happen in America when Maura was here. It wasn't going to happen even in, during the Troubles. It was going to take a long time. But that the only thing that you could do was pass on the flame, which is, I think, what she wanted to do.
Pass on the mic for one last question.
Well, the truth is my question was kind of asked now, which is a terrific question, really. I've been thinking about it, but I would like to congratulate you as well for this remarkable talk, and for even, I'll quote yourself here, giving us really an agenda, the recovery of lost, forgotten, or buried women's history. And I'm humbled to say that there's at least there's a cohort of 2 lines here of grad students who are exactly engaging in that here in Boston College. It's great for me to see that, people taking that flame. And it's also the great time to do it because the decade of centenaries raised that agenda. And it's very much at the cutting edge now of historical work in Ireland. When I think of women's history at the cutting edge, but specifically of the revolution, how we understand the memory of the revolution. So that really chimes perfectly. I would like to push you, though, a little bit further on that question, if I can. And I'm thinking, okay, she remains an ardent Republican, but as we know, memory is processed as time develops, and she looks back. And she has plenty of things to look back on which are troubling. I mean, you mentioned, for example, the way you described the intimidation of jurors and different things that she was involved in, or even things that weren't mentioned here. I mean, when she was imprisoned, I think for the first time, it was over the attempt to kidnap Cosgrave, right? So there's kind of shady events happening. And even later, she has a break with the IRA because she takes a principled stand against the IRA with Stephen Hayes, the
Yes,
affair.
yeah.
So, I mean, these issues, even if it's not a disillusionment with republicanism, but does she kind of process some of these difficult events later in different ways, in less in the letters which she wrote at the time, but when she looks back at it at different moments?
Well, I think the Stephen Hayes case is a fascinating case, and one that I hope somebody someday will look at more closely. But I mean, really, Stephen Hayes was somebody, it was a very complex story, but basically he was considered to be a spy, and he was taken by the IRA, and he managed to escape, and he went to a police station. But during his time when he was incarcerated by the IRA, he supposedly wrote this confession. And it became a sort of a dispute, and she did take a principled stand at that time, but it was because she believed that he hadn't been given a fair trial or a fair hearing, and that was her modus operandi. And when I looked through the archives and at that particular case, I was a bit incensed by Stephen Hayes, because he used to write her these letters saying, now Máire, you need to do this and you have to do that, and he was kind of like, he was quite sharp with her, and I just wondered why she kind of why she took that. But in the end, I think her stance was, look, he may be this or he may be that, and I think he wasn't a very pleasant person. So, that was a problem. But that what she felt was that the Republican movement should always give a fair trial, and that she didn't feel he had got that. So her break really was, a lot of people broke with her, actually. And it took her a long time to sort of be brought back into the movement, or allow herself to go back into the movement. But she never stopped being a Republican. And I believe that even though there are things that you could go, oh my goodness, like that is something that somebody might regret, but that she felt, I think, that it was war, and that's what happens in war.
Oh, I guess, well, if John McColgan has a question, we have to have John, and then we'll wrap here. Okay.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Christian. This has been just a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Hilary. And for me personally, it's been a wonderful going back to my visits with Máire, and it's just exciting for me, to hear what you have to say, and I'm really looking forward to the book. I'd like to tell you a couple of stories that she told me. I don't know if they have made it into print or not, but first I'd like to point out that one person who needs to be credited for the preservation of the archives is Professor Dudley Edwards. Professor Edwards was my supervisor back at UCD, and he had Máire to attend a talk I gave to the Dublin Historical Society on Lionel Curtis, who was an advisor to the British, I think it was second secretary to the British delegation to the treaty talks. And it was he who defined the British position on what the constitutional position was going to be. And I think that's why she liked the talk. And Professor Edwards he brought me up to see her at St. Nessens. And thereafter, I went up on my bicycle to Sandy Ford and interviewed her and looked at her papers and so forth. But now a couple of the stories she told. First of all, you mentioned the forecourts and how it was blown up at the start of the Civil War in June of 22. The Republicans inside had stored all their ammunition near the record office. And when Collins started bombarding the forecourts with artillery he got from Churchill, one of them landed the shell landed in the public record office and blew records going back to the 12th century as far away as Hoth. And, but she was in the forecourts, in the rotunda of the forecourts, and she described what it was like at that time. She said she was ordered, everybody in the rotunda area was ordered to go up against the wall and to hold on to the railings on the wall in this round area. And when the explosion happened, that big, huge, mighty building, she said, rocked back and forth. And it was a story I'll never forget.
That is actually in the memoir.
Oh, it is good.
Yeah,
Good.
yeah.
Good. The other story was when she was in America, one of her observations of American audiences was that all the Americans, she said, chew gum. And she said, when I was speaking to an audience of Americans, all the jaws were going up and down. But you could tell when you made a good point when all the jaws stopped. Did you ever hear that one?
That's a great story, yeah.
That wasn't the memoir.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We're gonna stop our jaws from talking. We're gonna start them from eating. Okay, we're a little hungry here, right? Who's hungry this evening? Okay. So first of all, just to thank Hilary once again. This is so important.